when I got off one of the tango boats, it was a little bit further in my tour, like about the third or fourth month, about the third month. I had progressed a little bit, became a little bit smarter. And I think I became too smart because then they put me in the front. I became a pointman. Pointman is usually you're leading the squad, the platoon, or the company. And so me and one of my buddies, we used to switch. He would say, Ralph, it's your day to walk point. I go, okay, let's go. And then I would tell him, it's your day to go today. And so this day he's walking. And we're actually leading the battalion, which is three companies. And we're getting into some heavy jungle. And we're in the front, so we're walking comfortable. But the rest of the battalion is stringing out too far. And so the word comes out to slow down. We're walking too fast for them. So he's about 5 yards away from me. And I tell him, I says, you need to hold up. The rest of the battalion needs to catch up. So he turns around, looks at me, and as he's making like a U-turn, he steps down, and I saw the flash, and I actually saw like the metal fragments coming, and there was a guy behind me, and I told him, I said, it's a grenade. But when I saw it and reacted, it still wasn't fast enough, and I thought I was quick, because you're a young man, you're in perfect shape and everything. But it got me in the leg, and it got me near my nose, and the guy that stepped on it, he got it in a lot of shrapnel on his leg, and he was wounded enough where they used to send him to Japan for medical treatment. Got to Japan, he got to go back home.
Ralph Collin used the Spanish language to save his entire squad from friendly fire deep in the jungles of Vietnam. And what he pulled off that night, in complete darkness, on a military radio, with his own artillery landing on his position, is one of those stories that sounds almost too remarkable to be real. But it happened, every bit of it, and it deserves to be told the right way. Let's start at the beginning, because you can't really understand what Ralph did on that radio without understanding who Ralph was, where he came from, and what the war he was fighting actually looked like day to day. Ralph Collin grew up bilingual. His family spoke Spanish at home, the way a lot of Latino families did in the United States in the 1940s and 1950s. English at school, English on the streets, Spanish at home with the family, Spanish in the neighborhood, Spanish woven into the everyday rhythm of life from as far back as he could remember. He didn't think of it as a special skill. He didn't think of it as anything particularly notable. It was just how his family communicated with each other. It was just life. It was just home. And that thing, that completely ordinary, completely unremarkable everyday thing, would turn out to matter more than almost anything else Ralph brought with him when he got to Vietnam. But we're going to get there. There's a lot of story to tell before we get to that night. Ralph entered the army, went through training, and eventually found himself in Vietnam. And the early part of any tour in that war, for most of the men who served there, was this brutal, disorienting adjustment period. You're learning constantly. And you're learning fast, because the cost of not learning fast is too high to think about. Everything you thought you knew about what war looked like got replaced very quickly by what it actually was. The terrain, the tactics, the pace of things, the sounds, the smells, the way danger could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was all completely different from anything training had prepared you for. You adapted or you didn't, and most of the men who made it through that adjustment period emerged from it changed in ways that are hard to fully describe. Ralph adapted. He got sharper. He got more confident. He started to understand the rhythms of the specific war he was actually in, out in the river areas and the jungle terrain between Long Bin and Bearcat, where his unit operated. They were not stationed at a big forward operating base with facilities and buildings and the relative comfort of a fixed position. Ralph's war was the field. They moved around constantly, operated from campsites that shifted, slept outdoors, and the mission was always the next one. That was the texture of it. Just the jungle and the men and whatever was waiting in the dark. By around his 3rd month in country, something had visibly shifted in Ralph. He'd gotten experienced enough and confident enough and capable enough that the people responsible for making these decisions noticed, and they made a call. They put Ralph up front. He became a pointman. Pointman. If you've never heard the term, it's exactly what it sounds like. You are at the absolute leading edge of the unit. You are the first set of boots on the ground as the column moves through whatever terrain you're in. You see what's there before anyone else sees it. You find the threat, or the threat finds you, and sometimes you have very little say in how that plays out. For a lot of men, the idea of walking point was the thing they dreaded most. For Ralph, it became something else. Not that he wasn't afraid. Fear was part of every single day for every single soldier in that war. But he had a kind of confidence in his own judgment, his own instincts, his own ability to read what was happening around him that made the position fit. He and a buddy used to take turns. "Ralph, it's your day today, all right, let's go." And then the next rotation, "Okay, your turn." They shared the weight of it. They trusted each other with it. That kind of trust is what that war built between men. And it was real. And it mattered. Now, before we get into the heart of what this story is really about, I want to take a quick second. If you're watching this, and you're the kind of person who thinks these men deserve to be remembered, the ones who served, the ones whose stories don't always make the big history books, this channel exists for exactly that. I post these regularly, and I take every single one of them seriously. If you want to be here when the next story goes up, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it's how we keep this going. Okay, back to Ralph. It was around his 3rd or 4th month in country that something happened that both almost ended Ralph's tour and set the stage for the story that this video is really about. On this particular day, it was his buddy's rotation to walk point. And they weren't just leading their squad that day. They weren't just leading their platoon. They were out in front of the entire battalion, 3 full companies of men strung out in a column behind them, moving through dense, heavy jungle. The terrain in that part of Vietnam is the kind that presses in on you from every side. Thick vegetation, poor visibility. The kind of jungle where sound travels strangely, and distance is hard to judge. Not the kind of environment where mistakes have small consequences. The column had stretched out too long. Word came forward. "Slow down, the battalion needs to catch up. You're moving too fast." Ralph called out to his buddy. "Hold up, they need to close the gap." His buddy turned to acknowledge him, started that pivot back. Made what Ralph describes as a kind of U-turn, and stepped on something, a booby trap, a grenade. The flash happened so fast that Ralph later said he actually saw the metal fragments in the air coming toward him before he could fully react. He called out, "It's a grenade!" But the warning and the reaction both came a fraction of a second too late. A piece of shrapnel caught him in the leg. Another piece caught him near his nose. His buddy, who'd stepped on the device, took a far worse wound, severe enough that he eventually got medevaced all the way to Japan for medical treatment. He didn't lose his leg, which Ralph says was fortunate, and it absolutely was. The man directly behind Ralph had been hit in the arm, and then the shooting started, because that's what booby traps were designed to do in that war. They announced your presence. They told the enemy exactly where you were and what direction you were moving in, and the enemy opened up on them as soon as it went off. Ralph started moving toward the most severely wounded man to get to him, and the soldier with the arm wound stopped him. "Don't go! Don't leave me!" Ralph said. "I need help too." And he says he laughs telling it now, though it was about as far from funny as anything can be in the actual moment. But he stayed. He stayed with the wounded man beside him. The two of them held that position together, kept their heads down, kept the enemy at bay, until the rest of the unit moved forward and they were able to properly help the man who'd been most badly hurt. Helicopters came in and extracted the wounded. Ralph's leg was bandaged. That was the worst of his injuries physically. The shrapnel near his nose was removed and stitched up. The doctor told him he'd done such a precise job that Ralph wouldn't be able to see the scar no matter how long he lived. Ralph was given 4 days off, though technically the first day counted as the day of the wounding, so it was really 3 days. 3 days to eat hot food, sit at the NCO club and have a beer, breathe without a mission hanging over every minute. He said he was happy. He appreciated it. He ate some hot chow, relaxed a little, got a chance to just be somewhere other than in the field for a few days. And then he went back. Back to the same company, the same platoon, the same squad. Back to the river areas, back to the jungle, back to the mission. And it was on those missions, the nightly ambushes, the search and destroy patrols, the constant movement through the dark with maps and radios, that the thing this video is really about happened. Ralph's unit followed a consistent rhythm during this period of his tour. They'd leave their platoon area around 5:30 in the evening, right at dusk, right as the last of the light was dropping out of the sky. They'd move to a position, set up the ambush, stay there through the night. Every squad in the area knew where every other squad was positioned, because in the dark, in that jungle, not knowing could get your own men killed. The maps were everything. Knowing where you were and being able to communicate that position accurately was the difference between coordination and catastrophe. Every squad leader was responsible for that for his own men. Ralph had become the kind of squad leader who took that responsibility completely personally. He's talked about why he led from the front, why he put himself at point when he wasn't entirely certain he could trust the men around him to do what the situation required. Not because he thought he was better than they were, but because he understood the stakes clearly enough to know that if something went wrong out front, it would be because of the decisions being made out front. And he wanted those to be his decisions. He'd look around the squad and think, I'm not sure I can trust those guys to stay awake all the way through. I'm not sure they'll take the right path when the path forks. I'm not sure they'll make the right call at 3 in the morning when everything is quiet and fatigue is pulling at them. So instead of finding out the hard way, Ralph would say, Here, let me go. I know what I'm doing. I know this map. I know this area. Let me lead. He'd tell the newer men, Wait until you've got more time in. Wait until I rotate home, and then you'll take the lead. That's a certain kind of person. That's a man who understands what leadership actually means when the stakes are real. On this particular night, Ralph's squad was out in their position, in the field, set up, doing what they did every night. When artillery rounds started coming in, not enemy rounds, their own, friendly fire, their own artillery firing on their own position. This is, for anyone who's read about it or heard veterans describe it, one of the most terrifying and disorienting experiences a soldier can have. You spend all your time training to deal with incoming from the enemy. There is no training that adequately prepares you for the specific horror of realizing that the fire coming in on your position is from your own side. Artillery doesn't care about intent, it lands where the trajectory takes it. And if you're in the wrong spot, the reason behind it is completely irrelevant. A marking round came in first. That's what artillery units fired to calibrate their position before running a full fire mission. A single round to see where it lands so they can adjust. It hit the mud near Ralph's squad. He said afterward that if that marking round had traveled just a couple of feet in either direction, it would have landed directly on one of his men. That was all he needed to see. He got his squad moving immediately, up and running, heading back toward the road they'd come in on, getting out of the impact area while he was simultaneously trying to work the radio. His radio operator got the platoon sergeant on the line. Ralph needed to communicate their position, tell the platoon sergeant exactly where they were so the artillery could be redirected or stopped before the next rounds came in. He gave the platoon sergeant the map coordinates. The platoon sergeant said he didn't have the map with him. "Just tell me where you are." And then, almost in the same breath, the platoon sergeant changed his mind. "Never mind," he said. "Don't tell me where you are. The enemy might be listening on the frequency." And there's the problem, right there. That's the wall Ralph ran into, in real time, while his squad was still moving, while the threat of more rounds was still very real, while he needed to communicate something that he simultaneously couldn't communicate. "Tell me where you are." But don't tell me where you are. Two impossible things, and the only way to satisfy both of them at once was to find a third thing that nobody was expecting. Ralph asked for Villa. Villa was one of his soldiers, another man in the unit who also spoke Spanish. Ralph got him on the radio. He said, "You speak Spanish, right?" Villa said yes. Ralph said, "I'm going to tell you where we are," in Spanish. And that's what happened. Ralph reported his squad's exact position over the military radio in Spanish. He described where they were relative to where they'd been the night before. They'd been on the left side of the operational area the previous night, and tonight they'd moved to the right. He gave Villa the specific details in clear, conversational Spanish, and Villa understood every word. Villa could relay the information up the chain. The platoon sergeant would know where Ralph's squad was. The artillery coordinates could be corrected. Nobody was going to get killed by their own rounds. Somebody else on the frequency broke in. They'd been monitoring the channel and heard the whole thing. "What are you saying? What language is that? What are you guys talking about?" That voice, whoever it belonged to, couldn't make heads or tails of what they were hearing. Ralph and Villa kept going. They got the information through completely. The artillery stopped. The squad was safe. Every single man in Ralph's squad went home that night the same way they'd gone out. Now think about that. Just sit with it for a second. A young soldier in the middle of a combat zone at night, under active friendly fire, with no time to consult anyone or look anything up or wait for permission, improvised a real-time field communication solution that worked perfectly. He identified the problem, assessed the resources he had available, and acted on the one resource nobody else in that situation was going to think of, because nobody else in that situation had grown up in a bilingual household. That's not luck. That's not an accident. That's a kind of thinking under pressure that most people never have to demonstrate, and wouldn't know they had until the exact moment required it. The next morning, Ralph and Villa were told to report. The platoon leader needed to talk to them about what had happened on that radio. And then, a small helicopter set down. The battalion commander. A colonel, or very close to it. This was a senior officer who'd gotten word of the radio exchange the night before, and wanted to hear it directly. First question out of his mouth, whose idea was it to speak in another language? Villa pointed right at Ralph, no hesitation. That was Rhee's idea. The battalion commander turned to Ralph and asked what language they'd been speaking. Ralph told him Spanish. The colonel reached out and shook Ralph's hand. He said it was a damn good job. And then he said something Ralph hadn't heard before. He said, "You know what? Nobody ever told me I had code talkers in my battalion." Code talkers. Ralph sat with that for a second. He was young and he knew the reference. The Navajo code talkers from World War II were becoming more widely known by the late 1960s, though the program had been classified for years, and the full story was still emerging into public recognition. The colonel was making a direct and deliberate comparison. "I didn't understand a word you were saying," he told Ralph. "And if I couldn't understand it, I can guarantee the North Vietnamese didn't either. What Ralph had done, without planning it, without being trained for it, in the middle of an emergency with rounds coming in, mirrored the foundational principle behind one of the most celebrated communication strategies in American military history. The Navajo Code Talkers program in World War II was formal and structured and deliberately designed. The Marine Corps recruited Navajo speakers specifically because their language was so complex, so unfamiliar to Japanese intelligence analysts, and so orally based that it couldn't be decoded in real time even by people who had some exposure to Navajo. The program operated throughout the Pacific Theater and is credited by some historians as being a decisive advantage in certain critical operations, including the Battle of Iwo Jima. What Ralph Collin did in Vietnam bore no resemblance in terms of scale or formal structure. It was one squad, one night, one desperate radio call. But the underlying logic, use a language the adversary cannot interpret to communicate what cannot be safely said in plain language, was identical. Ralph had arrived at the same principle on his own, in real time, because he needed to, and because he had the tools to do it. The colonel understood that immediately. He gave it the right name. And he honored it with a handshake, and the kind of direct, plain-spoken acknowledgement that means something coming from a battalion commander. Ralph's account of all of this, in the years since, has been characteristically understated. He doesn't really know what made him think of it. The thought just came to him and he acted on it. He says it's kind of funny now, looking back, though it was absolutely not funny in the moment. That framing, the dry, quiet humor that Vietnam veterans so often apply to things that were genuinely terrifying, is one of the consistent things about how the men who served in that war tend to talk about it. There's a distance they put between themselves and the worst of it, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered so much that humor is sometimes the only way to bring it into ordinary conversation. I want to stop here and say something, because we're at a point in this story where I think it's worth pausing. If you're watching this and it's landing with you the way I think it will if you've made it this far, if you feel like stories like Ralph's are exactly the kind of history that needs to be preserved and shared, then I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. History like this doesn't preserve itself. It lives because people care enough to keep it going. That's what this channel is for, and it's what your subscription actually means. Okay, let's keep going. There's a broader context to Ralph Collin's story that deserves some attention, because his service doesn't exist in isolation, and the story is bigger than one night and one radio call. Latino Americans served in Vietnam in significant numbers. Mexico Americans in particular served at rates in combat roles that were disproportionate to their share of the general population. Estimates of Latino casualties in Vietnam have consistently been higher than their demographic percentage would predict. Men from communities across the Southwest, from Texas to California to New Mexico and beyond, ended up in exactly the kind of front-line infantry combat positions that Ralph's story reflects. And for a long time, for decades after the war ended, their service was underrepresented in the national conversation about Vietnam veterans. The monuments and the museums and the cultural memory of that war have gotten better about including them over time, but there's still meaningful ground to be covered. Stories like Ralph's matter not only because they're remarkable in their own right, but because they represent a whole community of American military service that deserves the same recognition, the same space in the national memory as any other veteran's experience. Ralph had an identity that his bilingualism was simply part of his family, his upbringing, his community, his sense of who he was. It wasn't a military asset he'd been recruited for. It wasn't on any form he filled out when he enlisted, flagged as something to be utilized. It was just him. It was just part of where he came from. And it turned out, in one specific, critical, life-or-death moment in a Vietnamese jungle, to be exactly what the situation required. The relationship between Ralph and Via also deserves more attention than it sometimes gets in the retelling. The radio solution only worked because there were two of them, two Spanish speakers who knew each other, trusted each other, and could communicate quickly and clearly under pressure. Ralph came up with the idea, but Via getting on that radio and executing without hesitation, following Ralph's lead in real time, understanding what was being asked of him and doing it, that was just as essential as the idea itself. Neither of them could have done it alone. That's the nature of what unit cohesion actually is in combat, when you strip away the formal definitions and look at what it means in practice. It's two men who know each other well enough to work together in an emergency without explanation. It's trust that's been built over months of shared danger, and when the moment came, it held. Ralph has talked about what it felt like to be a squad leader in that environment, the weight of constant responsibility, the knowledge that the men behind him were depending on him to read the map right, to pick the right path, to make the right call when it mattered. He didn't always feel certain. He was young. They were all young, practically everyone in those units. But he had a quality that effective leaders tend to have, regardless of their age or experience. The ability to assess a situation clearly, to identify what it needed, and to step into that role without waiting for someone else to do it. Here, let me go first. That line runs through multiple parts of how Ralph talks about his time in Vietnam, and it's consistent. It's not ego, and it's not recklessness. It's a very clear-eyed understanding of his own capability, combined with a willingness to act on it when the stakes are real. That's a particular kind of character. Not everyone has it. Ralph did. The rest of Ralph's tour continued on, however many months remained after the night of the Spanish radio call. The nightly ambushes, the search and destroy missions going out at dusk and coming back before dawn. The constant low-level tension of living in a war zone without a fixed base, without a permanent structure, sleeping in the field and moving when the mission required it. He's described the repetition of it. Every day the same thing, just a different area. The way the days bleed together in that kind of environment, but every single one of them carries the possibility of being the one that changes everything. That's a kind of sustained psychological pressure that's very hard to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. You hold it, you carry it, and then, eventually, if you're fortunate, you come home. Ralph came home. He carried what he'd experienced the way Vietnam veterans tend to carry things, with him, not always openly, not always easily, but with him. The story of the Spanish radio call is one of the things from his service that has stayed clear and specific in his memory over the years, and that makes complete sense. It has a shape, it has a problem, and a solution, and a resolution. It ends with a battalion commander shaking his hand and calling him a code talker. That's the kind of memory that doesn't blur with time, it stays. And when Ralph tells it now, he tells it the way he lived it, with that dry, understated humor, with genuine honesty about what he doesn't know and what he does, without inflation or dramatization. He says he doesn't really know what made him think to do it, just something came to him. He acted on it. It worked. He keeps it simple because it is simple, even though it was extraordinary. There's a version of American history that gets told in the broad strokes, the famous battles, the well-known names, the moments that made it into textbooks and documentaries. And then there's the other version, the one that lives in the specific memories of specific men and women who were actually present, who did the actual things, in the actual moments, in the actual dark. Ralph Collins' story belongs to that second version. It doesn't need to be inflated. It doesn't need any dramatic license added to it. It's remarkable enough on its own terms, and it's true. And it happened exactly the way Ralph says it happened. A young bilingual soldier from a Latino family, leading his squad in the Vietnamese jungle on a dark night, with his own artillery coming in on his position, who thought to switch languages on a military radio and communicated his squad's exact position to the one other man who could understand him, and in doing so, kept every single man in his squad alive. That's the story. That's what Ralph Collins did. And he did it because of something that came from home, because of something ordinary, because of the language his family spoke around the dinner table. The colonel who shook Ralph's hand understood immediately what he'd witnessed. He reached back through military history and pulled out the right comparison. The code talkers, the men who'd used their native language as an unbreakable cipher in a previous war, because he recognized the principle, even if he'd never expected to see it applied in this way, in this place, by a young squad leader who hadn't planned any of it. Ralph Collins had done something genuinely clever in a moment when there was no time to be clever, and he'd done it because of who he was. Before we close out this video, I want to say one more thing. If you've stayed with this story all the way through, you already understand why it matters. You don't need me to convince you of that, but if you want to keep coming back for stories like this, veterans who did real things, who thought fast in impossible situations, who came home and deserved to be remembered by name, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who should hear it. That's the most meaningful thing you can do for men like Ralph Collins. Pass the story on. Keep it going. Make sure it doesn't disappear. Ralph Collins is the kind of man who would probably tell you he didn't do anything all that special. He'd say he just did what needed to be done with what he had. And that's true. But what he had, and what he did with it, and what it meant for the men behind him on that dark night in Vietnam, that's worth remembering. That's worth telling. That's worth holding on to. He went out with his squad and he brought them back. He did it with Spanish, and with quick thinking, and with the trust of a man named Villa, who got on that radio and followed his lead without hesitation. And a colonel shook his hand and called him a code talker. And he was right to do it. Ralph Collins, that's the name, don't forget it. Let's go back and fill in more of what Ralph Collins' day-to-day reality looked like, because the story of the Spanish radio call gains a lot more weight when you understand the full environment it happened in. Vietnam in 1968 and 1969, which covers the general period of Ralph's service, was in the middle of a particularly intense phase of the war. The Tet Offensive had shaken American military and political assumptions about how the war was going in early 1968, and in its aftermath, combat operations in the 3rd Corps area, which includes the Long Binh and Bearcat region where Ralph's unit operated, remained intense and unpredictable. The enemy that American forces were dealing with wasn't a traditional military that held fixed lines and moved in predictable formations. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units operating in that region were experienced, disciplined, and intimately familiar with the terrain. They used that familiarity in every way they could: booby traps, ambushes, movement at night, supply lines that seemed invisible to American reconnaissance. For the American soldiers on the ground, it meant constant vigilance and constant uncertainty. You could never fully know what any given stretch of jungle held. Ralph's unit operated without a fixed base. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it shaped everything about their experience. They moved around constantly, sleeping in the field, setting up temporary campsites that shifted with the mission. There was no perimeter you could retreat to at the end of a patrol, No permanent structure that offered any meaningful protection. No routine that involved coming in off a mission and spending the night somewhere that felt secured. You went out, you came back to wherever the platoon was camped, you slept in whatever cover the terrain offered, and then you went out again. Day after day, night after night. The psychological weight of that accumulates in ways that are hard to overstate. The search and destroy missions that Ralph's unit ran were a central feature of American ground strategy in that phase of the war. The idea was to find enemy units, engage them, and eliminate them, deny the enemy's safe territory, disrupt their operations, prevent them from consolidating control over contested areas. In practice, on the ground, this meant moving through terrain that could hide anything, looking for an enemy that didn't want to be found until it chose to be, and knowing that the next step could be the one that triggered the thing that changed everything. It meant a constant, low-level dread that became, over time, something you learned to carry without letting it paralyze you. Most of the men who served in that environment will tell you that you stop thinking about it consciously after a while. You just move. You just watch. You just do the job. And the nights were particularly demanding. Going out at dusk, setting up ambush positions in the dark, staying still and quiet for hours while every sound in the jungle could mean something or nothing. The insects, the rain, the mud, the heat that didn't fully break even at night in those river areas, staying awake when every part of your body wanted to sleep, staying alert when alertness had become a kind of chronic background state that was exhausting to maintain. Ralph has described the sameness of it. Every day the same thing, just a different area. And that sameness had its own peculiar quality, because the stakes never actually went down. It wasn't routine in the way that routine usually feels. It was repeated danger, and the repetition made it feel almost ordinary, even though it was anything but. As squad leader, Ralph carried the additional weight of being responsible for the men in his charge on top of everything else. Every decision he made had consequences not just for himself, but for the other men in the squad. When to move, when to hold, when to call in on the radio, how to read the terrain, how to interpret what the map was telling him about where they were relative to where they needed to be. He didn't take that lightly. He's been clear about that. He took it personally. He took it on himself to be the one who made those decisions, because he wanted to be sure the decisions were made right. And the thing about that kind of leadership, the kind Ralph Collin was exercising in that jungle in the late 1960s, is that it's not taught in leadership classes. It doesn't come from a manual. It comes from character, from a particular combination of confidence and accountability that some people have and some people don't, and that war has a way of revealing one way or the other. Ralph had it. The men in his squad would have been able to tell you that. The buddy who walked point with him and trusted Ralph with the rotation would have been able to tell you that. Via, who got on that radio without hesitation when Ralph needed him, would have been able to tell you that. Now, the tactical reality of what happened with the friendly fire incident deserves a little more context, too, because it puts the specific challenge Ralph faced in sharper relief. Artillery coordination in the Vietnam War was a complicated, high-stakes business. The nature of the conflict, no fixed front lines, units moving constantly, operations conducted in close proximity to one another in difficult terrain, created ongoing challenges for the fire support coordination that was supposed to prevent exactly what happened to Ralph's squad that night. Artillery units needed accurate, real-time information about where friendly forces were positioned before they could fire safely. When that information was incomplete or outdated, or when units moved without the fire support coordinators being properly informed, the potential for friendly fire incidents was real and recognized. It happened throughout the war, and it happened to units across the theater. The specific scenario Ralph described, a marking round coming in on his position close enough that a few feet of difference would have meant casualties, the immediate need to communicate his location to stop the fire, represents a situation where the communication system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of thing had broken down. The platoon sergeant didn't have his map. The radio channel was potentially monitored by enemy forces. The normal procedure for resolving the situation had hit a wall, and the men in Ralph's squad were in danger every second the situation went unresolved. What Ralph did in that moment was bypass the breakdown. He went around the obstacle rather than through it. The obstacle was that he couldn't communicate his position in plain language without potentially giving it to the enemy. His solution was to communicate in a language the enemy almost certainly couldn't use: Spanish. Not a code, technically speaking, it was just a language, spoken clearly and conversationally, completely understandable to anyone who spoke it natively, and completely opaque to anyone who didn't. It didn't require any preparation or any special training. It just required 2 Spanish speakers and the presence of mind to think of it. The man who broke into the radio conversation and demanded to know what language they were speaking was, presumably, someone monitoring the tactical frequency who heard sounds he didn't recognize and couldn't process. That reaction, the confusion, the demand for an explanation, is actually the clearest possible evidence that the solution was working. The channel was being monitored. Someone without Spanish was listening, and that person understood nothing, which means if the enemy had been listening on the same frequency, they would have understood nothing either. By the time Villa had relayed the information up the chain and the artillery coordinates were corrected, Ralph's squad had gotten clear of the impact area. The subsequent morning's conversation with the battalion commander confirmed what Ralph already knew from experience. It had worked. It had worked completely. And the colonel's immediate framing of it as a code talker situation reaching back to World War II for the comparison suggests that he understood both the principle and the significance of what had happened more deeply than most would have in that moment. The Navajo code talker's story by the late 1960s was becoming more publicly known, though still not fully recognized. The program had been declassified in 1968, which means it was relatively recent news at the time of Ralph's service. The colonel would likely have been aware of it through military channels even before it became widely public. His comparison was accurate in the ways that matter. The core principle, using a language unfamiliar to the adversary as a real-time communication tool, was exactly what Ralph had done. The context was completely different. The scale was completely different, but the principle was identical, and the colonel honored it accordingly. There are other things about Ralph Collins' service that his primary story sometimes overshadows, and those deserve some space too. The fact that he became a pointman is significant. Point was not a position that got assigned to people who were unreliable or uncertain. It was the position for the soldier the unit trusted most with that particular kind of responsibility. The ability to read terrain, to move carefully, to spot what didn't belong, to make split-second decisions about what was ahead. Ralph earned that position through 3 months of demonstrated capability in a combat zone. That's not nothing. That's the kind of assessment that gets made constantly in a unit under fire. And the men around you know whether you've earned it or not. The incident with the booby trap that wounded him also reflects something important. He saw the flash and called out the warning, even though the reaction couldn't be fast enough to prevent his own injury. That instinct, to warn the men around him before thinking about himself, is the kind of thing that reveals character under stress. He took shrapnel in the leg and near his face, got 3 days of recovery time, and went back to the same squad and the same missions. That's the nature of the service that men like Ralph Collin gave in that war. His relationship with the men in his squad, the level of trust, and the sense of mutual responsibility that comes through in how he talks about his time there, is also part of the broader picture. He stayed with the wounded man who asked him not to go. He improvised on the radio to save the whole squad. He led from the front because he didn't want to ask of anyone else what he wasn't willing to do himself. These aren't isolated incidents. They're a pattern. They're who Ralph Collin was in that environment. And then there's the simple fact that he came home. Not everyone did. Of the men who served in Vietnam, tens of thousands didn't come back. And many of those who did returned to a country that was deeply divided about the war they'd fought in, often greeting veterans with ambivalence or outright hostility, rather than the recognition they deserved. Ralph carried what he experienced the way most Vietnam veterans did. Not always easily, not always on the surface, but with him. He's told his stories. He's allowed them to be recorded and shared. And that act of bearing witness, of agreeing to let the story be told, is its own kind of service. The story of Ralph Collin and the Spanish language on that Vietnamese radio is one of those stories that sits at the intersection of personal history and something larger. It's a story about a young man thinking fast in a dangerous moment. It's a story about bilingualism as an unexpected military asset. It's a story about Latino service in Vietnam and the contributions that community made to a war that the country still grapples with. It's a story about the specific and profound trust between soldiers who share both a language and a mission. And it's a story about a battalion commander who had the wisdom to recognize what he'd witnessed and give it the right name. All of those things are true at once. They don't cancel each other out. They add up to a story worth telling and worth knowing. A story that belongs in the same conversations as the other remarkable things men did in that war under impossible circumstances. Ralph Collin wasn't trying to make history on that radio. He was trying to keep his men alive. But he made history anyway, in his own quiet, understated way, the way a lot of the most important things that happened in that war happened. Not with fanfare, not in front of cameras, but in the dark, in the field, between soldiers who depended on each other completely. That's who Ralph Collin was. That's what he did. And that's why it matters that we're still talking about it. Let's talk a little more about what the river areas around Long Binh and Bearcat actually looked like, because the geography matters to understanding why operations there were the way they were, and why a squad operating in that environment at night faced the particular set of challenges that Ralph's story describes. The 3rd Corps Tactical Zone in South Vietnam, which encompassed the area around Saigon, the Mekong Delta approaches, and the rubber plantation country to the north and east, was one of the most strategically significant regions of the war. Long Binh, which became one of the largest American military installations in Vietnam, was located northeast of Saigon and served as a major logistical and command hub. Bearcat, a base camp operated by the 9th Infantry Division, was nearby. The territory in between and surrounding these installations was contested ground, dense with vegetation in the river bottom areas, crisscrossed with waterways and rice paddies, laced with trails that the Viet Cong had used for years before American forces arrived and continued to use with considerable effectiveness throughout the war. The rivers mattered in a particular way. The Dong Nai River system and its tributaries created a network of waterways that the enemy used for supply and movement, and that American forces attempted to interdict through both riverine operations and ground patrols. Units operating in that area were constantly dealing with terrain that channeled movement in specific directions, that created choke points and natural ambush sites, that made night navigation genuinely difficult, even with good maps and experienced men. Ralph's squad was operating in exactly this kind of environment. The campsites they moved between were out in that terrain. The ambush positions they set up at night were along trails and paths that the enemy might use. The maps Ralph studied so carefully were their lifeline in that jungle. Night operations in that terrain had a particular quality that veterans of the region consistently describe. The darkness in dense jungle is not the ordinary darkness of a night without streetlights. It's a thick, layered darkness that closes in on you. Sound carries strangely. Animals move. The jungle itself is never fully quiet. Learning to interpret what the sounds meant, to sort the irrelevant from the significant, to hear the difference between ordinary jungle noise and something that shouldn't be there, was a skill that took time to develop, and Ralph had been developing it for months by the time the incident with the artillery happened. The radio communications that kept these dispersed units coordinated were essential and fragile at the same time. Essential because without reliable communication, squads operating in the dark in unfamiliar terrain had no way to call for help, no way to report what they found, no way to coordinate with other elements of the unit. Fragile because radios failed, because terrain affected signal quality, because battery life was always a concern, because the frequencies were monitored by both sides and anything said in plain language might be heard and used. The security of radio communications was taken seriously, and the platoon sergeant's caution about not giving away Ralph's position over an open channel, even in an emergency, reflects a real and ongoing operational concern. Ralph's solution bypassed that concern entirely, not by using encryption or a prearranged code he had neither available in that moment, but by using something he'd carried his whole life. The elegance of it is that it required nothing special. No equipment, no preparation, no coordination with higher command, no approval. Just two men who shared a language and the presence of mind to use it. Via's role in this, it's worth saying again, was not secondary. Via had to understand what Ralph was asking without it being explained in detail, had to execute clearly and accurately under the same pressure Ralph was feeling, had to relay information in real time while both of them were still moving through dangerous terrain. The trust between them, the kind of trust that develops between soldiers who've been through enough together to know each other's capabilities, made the whole thing work as smoothly as it did. If Via had hesitated, if the communication between them had been unclear, if the relay up the chain had been garbled or delayed, the outcome might have been very different. There's something worth saying about what it feels like to be the person whose idea it was, in the aftermath. Ralph has talked about the moment when Via pointed at him in front of the battalion commander. He said, "It was Rhee's idea." And Ralph's immediate reaction was something like, "Oh man, he's going to get me in trouble." That reflex, the instinct to worry about consequences, even when you've just done something that worked, is very human and very consistent with how soldiers in that era described their relationships to authority. You didn't know, in the moment before the colonel spoke, whether what you'd done was going to be praised or questioned. Ralph had improvised outside of established procedure. He'd used a non-standard method to solve a real problem. Whether that was going to be received as clever or as a breach of protocol wasn't clear until the colonel opened his mouth. The handshake and the code talker comment settled it definitively. But the moment before that, the moment of not knowing, is part of the story too. Ralph Collin didn't do what he did because he knew it would be celebrated. He did it because it was the only thing he could think of that might work, and he needed something to work right then. That's the nature of real decisions under pressure. They don't happen with the knowledge of how they'll be received. They happen in the moment, with incomplete information, driven by the need to solve the problem in front of you. And then you find out afterward how the world is going to interpret what you did. In Ralph's case, the world, in the form of a battalion commander with enough historical awareness to make the connection, interpreted it exactly right. It's worth spending a moment on the broader history of language use in American military service because Ralph's story connects to a longer thread that runs through the country's military history in ways that are genuinely interesting. The use of Native American languages as codes in World War I preceded the more famous Navajo program of World War II. Cherokee, Choctaw, Lakota, and other native languages were used by small numbers of soldiers in the First World War, when officers discovered that Native American soldiers communicating in their native tongues over field telephone lines completely defeated German signals intelligence efforts. The Germans couldn't crack it. They couldn't even identify what language they were hearing. The program was informal and limited in scope in that war, but it established the proof of concept. In World War II, the Marine Corps built on that proof of concept in a systematic way with the Navajo Code Talkers program. The program began in 1942, trained over 400 Navajo men as code talkers, and operated throughout the Pacific Theater. The Navajo language was ideal for the purpose. It was tonal, had extremely complex syntax, and had almost no written form, which meant there was essentially nothing for enemy intelligence analysts to study. The code talkers didn't just speak Navajo, they used a specially developed code within the language that substituted Navajo words for military terms in ways that required specific training to decode. It was, by most accounts, the only military code in American history that was never broken. What Ralph Collin did in Vietnam wasn't that. He wasn't working with a trained code, he wasn't operating as part of a formal program, and Spanish, while not widely understood by most Vietnamese, is far more widely studied globally than Navajo was in the 1940s. But the underlying principle was the same, and the battalion commander recognized it as such. In the absence of any other option, Ralph had used his native language as a real-time communication barrier, and it had worked. The question of whether the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong forces in that area might have had Spanish speakers available to monitor communications is one of those historical uncertainties that's difficult to resolve. In general, Vietnamese military intelligence focused on English, French, and various Vietnamese dialects. Spanish would have been an exceptionally unlikely language for them to have ready access to, particularly for real-time radio interception in the field. The man who broke into Ralph's radio communication and demanded to know what language he was hearing was almost certainly American, someone monitoring the tactical frequency who didn't recognize what he was hearing. The fact that even an American monitoring the channel couldn't understand it is strong circumstantial evidence that the communication was, for all practical purposes, secure. Ralph's story also raises a question about what other informal, improvised solutions soldiers in that war came up with that never got formally recognized. Combat environments throughout history have produced improvised solutions to communication, logistics, and tactical problems that worked in the moment and then disappeared into the general memory of the war without being systematically catalogued. Ralph's story is known because he told it, and because the battalion commander gave it a name that made it memorable. How many similar moments happened in that war, and in others, that never got named, never got recorded, never got passed on? This is, in part, why the work of recording veterans' stories matters as much as it does. The official record captures what it captures. The formal histories account for what can be documented through reports and after-action reviews and official commendations. But the texture of what actually happened in places like that Vietnamese jungle at night, the improvised solutions, the split-second decisions, the moments of individual character that changed outcomes. Those live in the stories that veterans tell when someone asks and takes the time to listen. Ralph Collin has been willing to tell his story. He tells it with that characteristic mix of humor and honesty, that understated quality that so many veterans from that era share, that way of recounting things that were genuinely remarkable without presenting them as remarkable. He just did what needed to be done. He just used what he had. It worked out. That's the story. But the story is remarkable, and it deserves to be told and kept and passed on. And that's what we're doing here, right now, with this video and with everyone that comes before and after it. The men who served in Vietnam, all of them, from every background, every community, every part of the country, gave something in that service that can't be fully quantified or fully repaid. Some of them gave everything. Some of them came home changed in ways they're still living with. Some of them found a way to make peace with what they experienced. Some of them are still working on it. And the ones who are willing to share their stories, like Ralph Collin, are giving something additional. They're giving the rest of us access to what that war actually was, in the human dimension that official records can never fully capture. Ralph Collin used Spanish to save his squad in Vietnam. He thought fast in an impossible moment. He used what he had. He brought everybody home, and decades later, he's still telling the story in that same grounded, honest, slightly amused way that makes you believe every word of it immediately, because that's just who he is. That's the story worth keeping. That's the man worth remembering. One more thing deserves to be said, and it's this. When we talk about veterans from the Vietnam era, there's a tendency, understandable but limiting, to focus on the trauma, on what the war cost, on the ways it damaged the men who fought it, the ways the country failed them when they came home, the decades of struggle with what they experienced. All of that is real and important, and has its place in the full accounting. But it's not the whole story. And it shouldn't be the only story. Ralph Collin's story is also a story about capability, about what he could do, about the specific, particular combination of background and character and quick thinking that made him the right man in the right moment on a dark night in Vietnam. He was a young man from a bilingual family who joined the army and served his country, and ended up in a situation that required something nobody had anticipated or prepared for. And he had exactly that thing, and he used it, and it worked. That's not a trauma narrative, that's a competence narrative. It's a story about what a person can do when they have the right combination of preparation and character and presence of mind. The men who served in Vietnam were not defined by their trauma, any more than they were defined only by their service. They were full human beings who brought everything they were, their upbringings, their languages, their communities, their characters, their fears, their capabilities, into an environment that tested all of it simultaneously. Ralph Collin brought Spanish. He brought the judgment to know when to use it. He brought the trust relationship with Via that made it possible to execute. He brought the leadership that had earned him the position of squad leader in the first place. All of those things came together on one radio call, on one night in Vietnam. That's worth honoring. That's worth remembering, not just as a curiosity or a clever anecdote, but as evidence of who these men were and what they brought to their service, and what their service meant. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I want to thank you. These videos are long because the people they're about deserve more than a summary. They deserve the full telling. And if you're not already subscribed, and you want to keep hearing stories like Ralph's, stories about men who served in ways that deserve to be known and remembered, please go ahead and subscribe and share this with someone who should hear it. every share means one more person who knows Ralph Collins' name and what he did. That matters more than you might think. Ralph Collins served his country in Vietnam. He led his men through a war that asked everything of them. He thought fast on a radio in the dark and used the language he grew up speaking to keep his squad alive. And a battalion commander shook his hand and gave him exactly the right name for what he'd done. Ralph Collins, code talker, squad leader, veteran. Remember him.